Welcome back, Nick. And for the rest of the interview, we could discuss some more interesting aspects of what you've come across.
Well, you can't run a UFO project without finding yourself drawn into anything else weird and wonderful. Not because it's necessarily within the terms of reference, but really because there's nowhere else to send anything strange. So I found myself, when I was in that post, and that was a job I did from 1991 through to 1994, I found myself receiving reports of crop circles, of ghosts at military bases. I was contacted by people who claimed to be psychics, capable of remote viewing, and wanted to become so-called psychic spies for their country. I even got drawn into what you might call apocalyptic debates about whether or not particular comets were heading for the Earth and what strategy we might have. And indeed, that was quite interesting because, as with the UFO issue, in other words, something that resonated with me personally and I felt was interesting and important, the whole NEO issue, near-Earth objects, comets or asteroids on collision course with Earth, popularized now through movies like Deep Impact and Armageddon. But at the time I was doing the job, yeah, indeed. But when I was doing that job in the early 90s, there really hadn't been much thought given to what we would call planetary defense in that context. And the amount of time that was being spent by astronomers on even detecting NEOs that might have an orbit dangerous to us was a tiny amount of time. So really, the issue was we're facing a potential threat here, and no one's taking it seriously. No one's doing anything about it.
And did you want to elaborate on crop circles and what kind of phenomenon you've seen personally or heard about?
Well, I had, I guess, what you call a watching brief on the crop circle phenomenon. In other words, it wasn't in my terms of reference, but I kept up with what was going on. I visited a few formations myself, and I had a couple of meetings with some of the people involved in crop circle research, some of the key people at the time, Colin Andrews, Ralph Noyce. Now, Ralph was interesting because, of course, Ralph Noyce, as well as being honorary, now let me get this right, I may have jumbled a couple of his appointments here, but he was, as far as I recall, honorary secretary of the Society for Psychical Research. He was also, I think, secretary of the Centre for Crop Circle Studies, and he took immense interest in this and spoke to me on many occasions to try and lobby me to have the subject treated with more seriousness by the MOD. Ralph, the interesting thing about Ralph is he was ex-MOD himself. He had retired at very senior level as an Under-Secretary of State some years before I joined, but his position was interesting, and of course it was difficult for me to not engage with someone who had been one of our own.
And you say lobby, how come you didn't embrace the idea of crop circles like wholeheartedly as you have with UFOs?
I probably would have done, but there was always a bit of politics with the UFO project. The MOD doesn't have a corporate view on the UFO issue. Again, the MOD is a bunch of people. Some are skeptics, some are believers, most are in between when it comes to UFOs. Now, yes, there's a policy, but really the number of people giving the issue any serious thought is fairly small. So we were a small little team, And there were a number of people who would have liked nothing better than to close us down. So if they had seen us too publicly straying into some of these really fringe elements, or elements which would have been perceived as rather more fringe, one or two people might have used that as an excuse to shut us down and say, look, it's one thing to look at UFOs because there's an allegation, inherently there's an allegation that there's something in your airspace. So it's a defence and national security issue. Patterns in the cornfields, and now you're out there, and that would have possibly been a bridge too far. So I had to play a fairly subtle game.
And where do things such as ghosts and what was the other thing you mentioned?
Remote viewing.
Remote viewing. How does this play into the whole MOD's view of credibility?
Ghosts really didn't. There's been a long association, a sort of dotted line relationship between the intelligence community and people who study the occult. But really, ghosts, we certainly got a lot of credible reports. Military bases. Interestingly, of course, many people associate ghosts with sudden and violent deaths. And it's perhaps no surprise that there are a number of very interesting ghost stories at military bases where, for example, Air Force pilots would have, for example, lost their lives crashing on takeoff or landing, often during the Second World War, where with some of the older establishments, people might even have been executed for various crimes. There were some very credible reports, and most of them would come from the military police, because they tended to be the people who would be on patrol and would tend to see these things. And of course, again, interestingly, the police often patrolled with dogs. And again, in the ghost literature, it's well known that dogs seem to be particularly sensitive to something unusual, ghostly, spirit, whatever. And I've heard many accounts of ghost sightings where the hackles have suddenly gone up and the dog has frozen on the spot, looked around, become very agitated. Then the police officer on patrol will report the typical dropping of temperature, all the usual signs. And it's not just military bases. Even the Ministry of Defence headquarters building, several of them, but even the main headquarters itself on Whitehall, there have been ghost sightings down there. And I've spoken to some of the guard force there. These are mostly retired military and police, fairly tough people. They don't spook easily, but there are parts of that building which, although it's comparatively modern, is built around the shell of a much older structure. And some of the original building, dating back hundreds and hundreds of years, is down in the basement. And there are places where they don't like to go. And these are tough guys. So it's interesting, but we didn't really do much with that. The remote viewing was more interesting because, of course, here was something with a potentially useful military application if we could get it to work. And indeed, you can go on to the Ministry of Defence website, type in the phrase remote viewing, and you'll find 100 it's mod.uk. Okay. Put in the term remote viewing, you'll find a report that runs to about 168 pages, was classified at the time secret UK eyes only, so only really one down from top secret. And it showed how the Defence Intelligence staff tried to get this to work. And of course, again, there's useful justification for that, because remote viewers, if you could get it to work, could find drug shipments, caches of terrorists' arms or the terrorist cells themselves, all sorts of things.
Have you seen an example of remote viewing that worked in front of your eyes? Have you seen anything?